All right, welcome back. If you have not been here before, my name is Matt. I'm a therapist in private practice. I also like to help other people run, start, grow their own private practices, right? So I help other therapists start their private practices. We're just going to get right into the video, but if you haven't been here before, please go ahead and subscribe down below. Hit the thumbs up button on this video. It really is helpful. Only if you want to though, there is no pressure. So today what we're going to do, we're going to go through my startup checklist. So a little while back, I made a checklist for how to start a private practice. This was my solo practice checklist. I have another one for group practices. I'll make a video on that soon. But today what I'm going to do is I'm going to just run through the checklist with you so that you have the checklist and you also have my thoughts on each item on the checklist. All right, so let's go ahead and go through that now. I will put the checklist up here on the screen. If you like this checklist and you want a copy of it, you might want to consider joining my membership community. This is like a consultation group. We have a online community where we talk about all things private practice and where I review and respond to every question and every item individually. So if someone asks a question in the community, I review it and then I respond to it. And not just a one-liner, but in-depth, multiple paragraphs. We also have webinars and all sorts of things as part of that consultation group. This is one of the items in there. So if you want to have this digital product, you can join that community. The link for that is down below. All right, so you'll notice that this checklist is split into two sections. The first one is the required section, and I use the term required to highlight things that you must do before seeing a client. And when I say must, I'm not a lawyer or an accountant, so you probably know that. I'm a therapist. So this is not legal advice, but these are things I would highly recommend you have done, and some of them you even need to have done before seeing your client for the first time, right? Legally, ethically, and we'll talk more about that as we go through the items. And then the second section is optional. So these are things that you don't necessarily need right off the bat, but can work on and do over time. All right, let's jump right in. So the first item is going to be malpractice insurance. You absolutely need this. This is going to protect you from any malpractice, right? You don't want to play games with this. So don't even question whether or not you should have it. You need it. It's very easy to get. It usually takes a day or two to process and actually have active. My advice to people is to use the malpractice insurance that is specifically tailored to your profession. So for example, I know social workers, we have something called the NASW. This is we have something called the NASW. This is the National Association of Social Workers, and they actually have a malpractice insurance that they work with. It's designed for social workers, so that's the one I use. There's one for counselors and other professionals as well. I mean, there's all sorts of companies out there. You can do your research, but that's usually what I recommend. Next on this list, we have what I call required forms. All right, I have a little asterisk next to it. And on the checklist, I'll zoom in here. You can see exactly what forms I'm talking about. Well, actually, it's really small on my screen. Let me just lean in for a second. The required forms here are the telemedicine informed consent, notice of privacy practices, informed consent and contract for outpatient therapy, client requests for confidential communication, and a credit card authorization form. Now, if you're wondering how I came up with that list of required forms and documents, it was after consulting an attorney. Those were all the forms that they shared with me. They actually gave me my intake packet and all those forms as well. I highly recommend consulting an attorney, especially one who specializes in private practice when thinking about your intake packet and required forms. But those, again, you don't play games with that. Make sure you have all of those in place. All right. Next up, we have practice policies. Now, practice policies are partially going to come from the forms that are hopefully written in conjunction with an attorney. And then there's also policies that you yourself as the private practice owner are going to have to come up with. So for example, late policy, right? So what's going to happen if a client arrives late? A cancellation policy, same thing as late, right? If someone last minute cancels on you. So there's all sorts of policies you want to think through and have established before you ever see your first client. And the big ones are these late cancellation policies, right? No-show policies. What about an emergency policy? So what happens if a client has a crisis? What do they need to do? What's your policy around that? Right, and these are partly things you should talk with the attorney with, and then you come up with them kind of based on your own experience as well. And of course, policies have to be written down and somewhere within your packet. All right. Next, you need a HIPAA-compliant record-keeping system. Now, I know there are some people who use pen and paper. There is a HIPAA-compliant way of doing that, but I would recommend that you use a virtual system, something like Simple Practice. There's others as well. I've been using Simple Practice my whole time in private practice. It works really well. It's HIPAA compliant, and it is a dedicated software to record keeping, documentation. It even has an integrated telehealth platform. It is basically the backbone of my practice. But you absolutely need a HIPAA compliant way of keeping records, right? People call these EHRs, EMRs, that kind of thing. If you want to use Simple Practice, you can go ahead and use my link down below. You will get a benefit. I think you'll even get 2 months free. But that link is down below. Next, you're also going to need a HIPAA-compliant audio-video platform. Now, if you're using Simple Practice, there's one already built in. And what I mean by this is a way of seeing a client, not face-to-face, it's virtual, but a way of kind of seeing and hearing a client, right? Zoom. That's one, right? You can get HIPAA compliant Zoom, you can use Simple Practice, but whatever method you use to see clients, you need it to be HIPAA compliant. All right. Now this list is mostly tailored for a virtual practice. But if you were to be an in-person practice, there would be one other thing we have to add, and that would be an office space, right? But for the sake of this video, we're talking virtual. So that's why the HIPAA compliant audio video platform is on there. Next, you also need an ability to accept payments, right? So if a client comes to see you for therapy, how are they going to pay you, right? And again, if you're using Simple Practice or any other EHR, a lot of them have built-in payment methods, which work really well, and there's no need to look any further. I know other people use things like IV Pay. This is a HIPAA-compliant form of payment. But when I consulted the attorney, they let me know that storing credit cards is where there's a lot of risk. Right? So if you decide you're going to store a card on file, you definitely want to make sure that's done in a platform that is HIPAA compliant and meant to do so. That's why I like to use Simple Practice, because that's what it's meant to do. And if I store a card, I know it's stored the right way. You definitely don't want to be storing cards in something like Venmo, Zelle. This is not how you would run your practice, right? Not HIPAA compliant. But you do need an ability to accept payments because it's important that you receive payment for your services. Next, you're going to need knowledge of your state's telehealth laws. Again, this pertains to not only telehealth, but just laws in general, your state's laws, right? So each state is going to have different guidelines and laws about how therapists practice. I encourage you, a lot of people have just big questions, right? So for example, if I'm licensed in New York, but my clients in California, am I able to see them, right? And so these are things you want to begin to answer, right? You don't want these to be unanswered before seeing your first client, especially these really big questions like, what if my client's there and I'm here? You want to make sure you look that up. There's all sorts of, the best way to do it is to go to your state's website. You can type in, I'm in New York State laws, social worker, telehealth, something like that, and go to the official New York State website. It will give you a bunch of information and sometimes has an FAQ section. If it's not clear enough, consulting with an attorney is probably going to be a really good idea to give you the peace of mind and to make sure that you know exactly what laws you need to be following. You also, in a very similar way, the next item is knowledge of your licensing board's telehealth policies. These are separate from the state laws. So you're, maybe you're a clinical social worker. You have a governing board, and we have different rules and regulations we have to follow. Now, this is where a lot of people have problems getting clear answers. The website's not really great. Often when you call, it's hard to get in touch. But again, I think with this one, you also want to consult an attorney if there's any gray areas that you're not sure about. All right, but definitely spend some time. It will take time to either read through the laws, consulting an attorney, but develop a strong knowledge of the state telehealth laws, state practicing laws in general, and the licensing board laws as well. Now, again, you're never going to know everything. You're not a lawyer, but for these two in particular, I always encourage talking to an attorney. I think that's the best bet. And then finally, you need a HIPAA compliant form of communication, right? And this is separate from like the Zoom or, seeing a client for a session, but a way of communicating in between sessions, sharing documents, things like that. Right. And so again, Simple Practice has one built in. There's a way to share documents with clients. There's a way to message clients. But if you don't want to use that, you're going to need a HIPAA compliant form of communication available in your practice. I know Google has one. There's all sorts of things. There's like Powbox, but that is required for someone to have a HIPAA compliant form of communicating with a client. And believe it or not, that is the required section, right? If you have all of that done, which in reality is really not that much. It requires perhaps a couple consultations or even just one with a lawyer, and it involves purchasing a couple platforms. If you go a Simple Practice, it's really just one platform. You're ready to see your first client, right? So that's really cool. That's the required section. And so let's move into the optional section here. And you'll see we have the short term and the long term. These are my own kind of criteria. Short term, these are things I recommend people start to think about pretty quick. You don't want to let these ones linger, although they are optional. You don't ever need to do them. I do encourage people to do these quickly, right off the bat, if they decide to do it. And then long term are these kind of like bigger things that you can work on over time and are not really pressing. All right. So let's start with the short term. The first one is listing on a directory, right? So I think in terms of getting your name out there, getting referrals and clients, of course, we can think about word of mouth and that kind of thing. But it's true, even still in 2023, that when a client looks for a therapist, they're often going to a well-known directory like Psychology Today. So having your name there is probably going to be helpful, right? And this is a bit of an investment. But again, when you're first starting out, you basically want to put your name in the places where people are looking, right? So Psychology Today is one, now maybe Alma's another. But think about what directories might be popular for people looking for therapy and try to get your name there, all right? You also might want to consider accepting insurance, right? A lot of people today are looking to use their insurance. A lot more providers are accepting insurance. So being able to take insurance in your private practice might be a good place to start if you're just building up, right? And there's a couple companies that make it super easy to do this. Alma's one and Headway's another. If you want to check those out, there's links down below. You also want to think about having a website. That's next on the list here. I think having a website is going to be important for several reasons. First, having a website is just professional, right? When was the last time you, went to a store or, didn't look someone up online, right? So having a home base online like a website is going to be super, it just makes you look professional. And it also will be a place where you can write about yourself or have online scheduling, right? It's going to be a really great place or a great thing to do. And secondly, if you ever grow and expand and want to do digital marketing and Google Ads, having a strong website is going to be crucial, and you can start building that out now. So I always encourage websites for people, and there's all sorts of places you can look to build one. And in fact, a lot of platforms are very user-friendly now. I personally use Squarespace. You also want to think about getting a business email address, phone number, etc. This could potentially be on the required side, although it's not required that you have a separate phone number or email address. It's certainly strongly recommended, right? If you have a personal email address, obviously you don't want professional emails from clients getting mixed in with those from, your family members and things. So, in the future, if I was to write this again, I might actually put this in required. But the reason it's not there is because technically, it's not required. And then secondly, a phone number as well, having a separate business phone number. And the good news is with things like Gmail and Google Voice, obtaining these things isn't that difficult. So having a separate business email, separate phone number, highly recommend. I also recommend establishing a business entity. This is a way of creating separation between you as a person and your business. There's a couple ways to do this. You can do something as thorough as the PLLC or the LLC, depending on where you are. There's something called an S Corp or a PC. I mean, there's all sorts of business entities. Now, if you're ever thinking about going into a group practice, then doing something like a PLLC or a PC is going to be the way to go. However, if you are a sole practitioner and you plan to kind of stay that way, you can do something called a DBA. This is called a doing business as. It doesn't cost very much money, and I think it gets established within like 24 hours. There's people that can help you do this. I used a company called Corporate Services. No, not called Corp. What's it called? Oh, Capital Services. I'll leave a link to them down below. Really great company. They helped me establish my PLLC. They also helped me do a DBA. But I do recommend establishing some sort of a business entity or a separation between you as a person and then your business. If you think you might want to do a group practice, then do the PLLC or the S Corp, or the PC. It's quite lengthy. It is a little bit costly, but in the long run, to have that established sooner rather than later, especially if you're doing group practice, it's going to be helpful. All right. And then in addition to that, there's the business bank account. Again, this one is not required, but very highly recommend. You do not want finances from your practice getting mixed in with your personal finances, right? So opening a business bank account is going to be crucial. And again, the way we do this is either by establishing the DBA, the PLLC, because we need an EIN, right? That's called an employer identification number. And this is going to allow us to open up a business bank account. All right, so that's the short-term stuff. A lot of that I recommend right off the bat. Some of that is like teetering on the line of being required, right? And then finally, we have this long-term section here. And these are things to work on steadily over time. So one is logo design, right? If you're thinking about your practice as a growing business, you want to have branding, you want to have a logo. So thinking about what that might be is a great thing to think about. A marketing strategy. So if you ever want to expand into a group practice, or you want to kind of have referrals that don't depend on psychology today or word of mouth, but you want them to be, coming from Google or people finding you online, developing a marketing strategy. I highly recommend working with a company to do this. Very complex. This would also include something like building SEO, search engine optimization, so that your website is working well and you're ranking on Google. Really complicated, but could really take your business to the next level. Something to consider. And then I have on here something called advanced website. I have this because I was differentiating between a simple website, like a simple practice website that you can get for the short term, and then long term, maybe something like Squarespace. But now that we're reading this today, maybe even just starting with the website that you want to grow into. So something like Squarespace, Wix, anything that has potential to grow into, right? This would be a good website platform to think about. I also have on here upgraded audio video equipment. This is super optional, right? But for me as a virtual practitioner, I like to, think about my virtual, my Zoom. I don't use Simple Practice, but when I log in with a client, what's on the screen, that's my office. That's important to me. So I eventually ended up I have a nice camera that I invested in, a nice microphone. Now, nothing crazy, nothing, top of the line, but nice that when you log in, it actually looks like this video here, professional looking, clean. And that was because I wanted to simulate a real office. So something to consider if you are going to be virtual and you want to continue to maintain kind of that professional look. And then very similar to that, I have people thinking about their set design, right? So what does your background look like in your space, in your office, wherever you're having your sessions, right? You want it to simulate a real office. And these are all things you don't need to do right off the bat, but things you can think about as you grow your practice and make it really professional looking and just really, really crisp. All right. And so this is the startup checklist. As you can see, there's actually not too much. It's not that overwhelming, right? Especially as we break it down like this. I hope going through this was helpful for you. I hope you learned something. And until next time, I look forward to seeing you soon.